The cramped wooden hull creaked under the weight of human cargo as the ship rolled through Atlantic swells. Between 1525 and 1866, over 12 million Africans were forced aboard slave vessels bound for the Americas. But the numbers alone cannot capture the horror of what happened during those voyages across the Middle Passage. Today we're examining the most devastating deaths that occurred aboard these floating prisons. Deaths so brutal, they shocked even the hardened sailors who witnessed them. What I'm about to share with you comes from ship logs, survivor testimonies, and medical records that document some of humanity's darkest moments at sea. These aren't just statistics or abstract historical facts. These are real people who suffered unimaginable torment in the belly of slave ships, and their stories reveal the true cost of the Atlantic slave trade. Before we dive into these accounts, I need to warn you that this content is extremely disturbing. But understanding this history is crucial because it shows us the depths of cruelty humans are capable of inflicting on one another. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Middle Passage remains one of the most horrific chapters in human history. Let me start with the Zong Massacre of 1781. Captain Luke Collingwood commanded this British slave ship, carrying 442 Africans from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. As the voyage stretched longer than expected, freshwater supplies dwindled to dangerous levels. Disease had already begun spreading through the overcrowded cargo holds where enslaved people lay chained together in spaces barely tall enough to sit upright. Collingwood made a calculated decision that would become one of the most infamous acts of the slave trade. Rather than risk losing his entire human cargo to dehydration and disease, he ordered his crew to throw living people overboard. The insurance policy would pay for slaves lost at sea, but not for those who died from illness or starvation. On November 29th, the crew began their systematic murder. They selected 54 sick Africans and forced them onto the deck. One by one, sailors hurled these bound and shackled people into the churning Atlantic waters. The victims, weakened by weeks of confinement and disease, had no chance of survival. They sank immediately beneath the waves as their chains dragged them down. The killing continued the next day. Another 42 people were thrown overboard, their screams lost in the wind and crashing waves. On the third day, the crew selected 36 more victims. But something extraordinary happened. 10 of these condemned souls broke free from their shackles and leapt into the ocean themselves, choosing to die on their own terms rather than wait for the sailors to murder them. The Zong's crew had murdered 132 people in cold blood over 3 days. When the ship finally reached Jamaica, Collingwood filed an insurance claim for the lost cargo. The case went to court but not to prosecute murder. Instead, it was a civil dispute over whether the insurance company had to pay for deliberately destroyed property. But the Zong was just one ship among thousands. The suffocation deaths aboard the Brooks reveal another dimension of Middle Passage horror. This vessel, designed to carry 451 enslaved people, was frequently packed with over 600 human beings. The cargo holds were divided into shelves barely 18 inches apart. Adult men were chained in spaces measuring just 6 feet by 16 inches. During storms, the hatches were battened down, sealing the holds completely. Fresh air couldn't circulate and the temperature soared. Carbon dioxide levels rose as hundreds of people struggled to breathe in the fetid darkness. Those on the lower shelves were crushed by the weight of people above them as the ship pitched and rolled. On one voyage in 1788, the Brooks encountered a violent storm that lasted for days. The crew sealed the holds tight to prevent flooding. Inside, panic spread as the air grew thin. People began passing out from lack of oxygen. Those who remained conscious listened to the death rattles of their fellow captives. When the storm finally passed and sailors opened the hatches, they found dozens of bodies. Some had suffocated from the poisoned air. Others had been crushed to death under the weight of unconscious and dying people pressed against them. The survivors were so weak they could barely lift their heads when light finally streamed down into their floating tomb. The sailors dragged out the corpses and threw them overboard without ceremony. The dead had become nothing more than waste to be disposed of. Those who survived would carry the trauma of those suffocating hours for the rest of their lives, assuming they lived long enough to reach their destination. These examples show us how the pursuit of profit transformed human beings into expendable cargo. Ship captains calculated death rates the way merchants calculated spoilage in grain shipments. A certain percentage of loss was simply built into the business model of slavery. But the worst was yet to come aboard vessels where disease took hold. The slave ship Henrietta Maria encountered something far worse than storms or deliberate murder when smallpox erupted in its cargo holds during a 1699 voyage from Angola to Barbados. The disease spread with terrifying speed through the packed human cargo, turning the lower decks into a pestilence-ridden hellscape that would claim nearly half the ship's captives. It began with a single infected child who had been torn from his village just days before the ship departed. Within hours of the first symptoms appearing, the virus began its deadly march through the confined spaces. Fever ravaged bodies already weakened by dehydration and malnutrition. The telltale rash emerged across faces and limbs, but in the darkness of the holds, many victims didn't realize what was happening until pustules began forming across their skin. The ship's surgeon, a man named Thomas Phillips, documented the horror in his journal. He described entering the cargo hold to find people delirious with fever, their bodies covered in suppurating sores. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, vomit, and rotting flesh that made even experienced sailors retch. Those still conscious begged for water, but the crew feared contamination and refused to approach the infected areas. As the disease progressed, victims experienced excruciating pain as pustules formed in their mouths and throats. Many couldn't swallow, dying slowly of dehydration while surrounded by their own bodily fluids. The dead lay chained to the living for days as the crew delayed removing corpses, terrified of catching the infection themselves. The ship's captain made the decision to throw infected people overboard while they were still alive, believing this would stop the contagion from spreading. Sailors wearing cloth masks dragged semi-conscious victims onto the deck and hurled them into the sea. Some were so weakened they couldn't even struggle as they were lifted over the rail. But perhaps the most disturbing account comes from the Portuguese vessel Nossa Senhora dos Remedios in 1734. This ship experienced what sailors called the bloody flux, a severe form of dysentery that turned the cargo holds into pools of human waste and gore. The disease attacked the intestinal lining, causing victims to evacuate blood and tissue from their bowels in agonizing spasms. Captain Manuel Santos recorded that the afflicted would cry out in pain as their bodies expelled bloody discharge continuously. The wooden floor of the holds became slick with a mixture of blood, mucus, and liquefied intestinal matter. Those forced to lie in these conditions developed severe infections as the waste ate away at their skin. The stench became so overpowering that crew members refused to go below deck. Victims lay in their own filth, too weak to move as their bodies literally dissolved from the inside. Some tried desperately to clean themselves with their bare hands, but the chains prevented any meaningful movement. Others simply gave up, staring blankly ahead as their life force drained away through continuous hemorrhaging. Santos noted that many victims remained conscious almost until the moment of death, fully aware as their bodies betrayed them. The psychological torture of being unable to maintain basic human dignity while dying slowly in a pool of waste broke many minds before their bodies finally surrendered. The horrors we've witnessed today aboard the Zong, the Brooks, the Henrietta Maria, and the Nossa Senhora dos Remedios represent just a fraction of the suffering endured during the Middle Passage. These weren't isolated incidents, but calculated brutality repeated across thousands of voyages spanning 3 centuries. The 12 million souls who crossed the Atlantic in chains deserve to be remembered not as cargo or statistics, but as human beings whose lives and deaths expose the devastating cost of treating people as property. Their stories must never be forgotten.